He had been eating alone for 3 years. Every single evening, same cracked wooden steps, same tin plate, same hollow silence where a woman's voice used to be. The whole town of Grover's Crossing had learned to look past Caleb Mercer the way you learn to look past a broken fence post. It's there, you see it, but you stopped expecting it to hold anything up a long time ago. Nobody stopped. Nobody knocked. Nobody asked. Until she did. And that one decision, that one stubborn, quiet act of seeing a man nobody wanted to see anymore, was about to change everything. If this story reaches your heart, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next, nobody in Grover's Crossing saw coming. The wind came early that September. It rolled down off the northern plains without warning, the way it always did in Nebraska. Not building, not announcing itself, just there one morning where it hadn't been the night before, bending the tall grass flat and sending the first dry leaves skittering across the hardpan like they were fleeing something. Eleanor Hayes stood at her kitchen window with a coffee cup she'd forgotten to drink from, watching the cottonwoods at the edge of her property thrash and shudder, and she thought, not for the first time that week, that this land had never once made anything easy. She was 34 years old, though most mornings she felt older. Not in a defeated way, more in the way a piece of leather gets older, worn down in certain places, yes, but tougher for it, shaped by the specific pressures that had been applied to it over years. Her hands showed it most clearly. They weren't a young woman's hands anymore. There were calluses along her right palm from the fence pliers, a scar across 2 knuckles where a spooked horse had introduced her to a gate latch at speed, skin roughened and darkened from too many seasons of working without adequate gloves. Because the gloves always wore through and replacement pairs cost money she didn't always have. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 2 years now, a fever that came on fast and left no room for argument. He was sick on a Monday and buried by the following Friday, and Eleanor had stood at that grave in the flat October light with her 2 children pressed against her sides, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the ranch, the cattle, the fencing, the water, the whole grinding machinery of keeping land alive was now entirely hers to run. She had not fallen apart. She'd wanted to, more than once, in the private hours after the children were asleep. But she hadn't. What she'd done instead was learn. She learned to read water levels and soil composition. She learned which of the 3 remaining ranch hands she could trust to show up sober, and which one needed watching. She learned to negotiate with buyers at the Kearney market, and to hold her price when they pushed, to push back with a level voice and no flinching, because they would always test a woman alone to see if she'd fold. She learned all of it imperfectly, with mistakes that cost her time and sometimes money. And she kept going. The coffee had gone cold. She set it down on the sill and turned back to the kitchen, where her daughter Anna, 8 years old and incapable of silence, was in the middle of an elaborate and one-sided conversation with the cat. "He doesn't understand you," said her son James from across the table, not looking up from the harness strap he was pretending to examine. He was 11 and had recently decided that pretending not to care about things was a sophisticated way to move through the world. "He understands perfectly," Anna said. "He chooses not to respond." "That's the same as not understanding." "It is absolutely not the same." Eleanor almost smiled. "Both of you eat." Oh, it was James who first pointed Caleb Mercer out to her, though he hadn't meant to do anything of the sort. They had been returning from Sunday service in the wagon. The road back to their property ran along the edge of the Mercer land for about a quarter-mile. When James, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the ride, suddenly said, "That old man is out there again." Eleanor had been managing the horse through a soft patch of road and didn't look up immediately. "Which old man?" "The one from the ranch, with the broken fence on the south corner." She looked then. Caleb Mercer was sitting on the steps of his cabin, maybe 200 yards off the road. Just sitting. He had a tin plate balanced on his knee, and he was eating from it slowly, methodically, the way a person eats when they're not really tasting anything, just performing the biological function of keeping themselves alive. The light was going golden and long, the kind of late afternoon light that made everything look more beautiful than it actually was. And even from the road, Eleanor could see that the cabin behind him was in poor repair. The porch railing was missing 2 sections. The chimney showed a dark stain along one side that suggested a flashing problem that had been left too long. There was a wagon wheel leaning against the exterior wall that looked like it had been leaning there for a year or more. He didn't look up as they passed. She didn't think he heard them. "He does that every Sunday," James said. "I've seen him before." "Every Sunday," Eleanor repeated. "And sometimes during the week, too. Margaret Hollis told me he doesn't talk to anyone in town hardly anymore, since his wife passed." Eleanor made a sound that wasn't quite a word and directed the horse around the soft patch and back onto firmer ground. She didn't say anything else about it, but she glanced back once, over her shoulder, before the bend in the road hid the Mercer property from view. Caleb was still sitting there, still eating alone. She asked about him in town the following week, not in any organized or deliberate way. Just the way you gather information in a small community, through the accumulation of half-sentences and asides and things said while people are doing something else. She mentioned his name to Ruth Calloway at the dry goods store, who made a small, sympathetic noise and said he'd been that way since Clara passed, going on 3 years now. She heard Hank Devers at the feed store mention the Mercer property in the context of whether the eastern field would produce anything next season, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer, and it wasn't good. She overheard 2 women after church service discussing Caleb in the specific hushed, pitying tone that small towns reserve for people who have become defined by their misfortune. What struck her was the consistency of the response. Everyone expressed sympathy. Nobody seemed to be doing anything. "He's made his peace with it," Ruth said, which Eleanor recognized as the thing people say when they mean we've made our peace with it. When they mean we've looked at this situation and decided it's too heavy to pick up, so we're going to call it settled and move on. She understood the impulse. She wasn't immune to it herself. The world of the Nebraska frontier was unsparing with its hardships, and there was a limit to how many of your neighbor's hard times you could carry before you stopped walking upright under the weight of your own. People weren't heartless. They were tired. But understanding a thing and accepting it were 2 different matters. So, she made a pot roast the following Sunday. This was not unusual. Eleanor made a substantial Sunday dinner most weeks. It was one of the few rituals she'd managed to preserve from the years when Thomas was alive, when Sundays had felt like a brief truce called between the family and the relentless demands of the land. A real meal. A tablecloth. Sitting down together without rushing. What was unusual was that when she set the pot in the center of the table, she looked at the 5 chairs around it. 2 occupied by James and Anna, one by ranch hand Pete Alderman, who ate with them most Sundays, one that had been Thomas's and that she still, 2 years later, had not moved, and then looked out the window in the direction of the Mercer property, just barely visible through the cottonwoods. She set an additional plate. "Mama?" Anna was watching her with the particular attentiveness that 8-year-olds direct at anything that deviates from pattern. "I'm going to go across and invite Mr. Mercer for dinner." Pete Alderman paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. James looked up from his food for the first time since sitting down. "Can you keep things warm for 20 minutes?" she asked Pete. He set his fork down. "I can, sure, Mrs. Hayes. He might not—" "I know he might not." She was already moving toward the door. "Keep it warm." Walked. The walk across to the Mercer property took about 10 minutes on foot, cutting through the far corner of the cottonwood grove and along the edge of what had once been a cultivated field. She could see the ghost of old row lines in the earth before the cabin came into view. Caleb was on the steps. She'd half expected him to be, and half hoped he wouldn't be, which would have given her a reason to knock and wait, and perhaps leave a message with someone, except there was no one to leave a message with, which was rather the whole point. He saw her coming from a distance and didn't move, didn't stand, didn't call out, just watched her approach with an expression she couldn't read yet, eyes narrowed slightly against the slant of afternoon light. He was older than she'd realized from the road, maybe 65, maybe closer to 70. The kind of age that on some people looks distinguished, and on others looks like they've been left out in too many seasons. He'd been left out in too many seasons. His face was deeply lined, and his posture, even sitting, had that particular quality of someone who has slowly stopped bothering to hold themselves straight. But his eyes were sharp. That surprised her slightly. She'd expected the eyes of someone who'd checked out, and instead found herself being assessed with full attention. She stopped at the bottom of his steps. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm Eleanor Hayes. My property runs along your south fence." "I know who you are," he said. His voice was rougher than she expected, like he didn't use it much, which from everything she'd heard, he didn't. "I've made a pot roast," she said. "There's more than my family needs. I'd like you to come have dinner with us." He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then he looked past her, at some middle distance she couldn't identify. "That's not necessary," he said. "I didn't say it was necessary. I said I'd like you to come." Another pause. He shifted on the steps. "I've already got supper started." She glanced at his tin plate sitting on the step beside him. Empty. His supper consisted of nothing she could identify. She didn't say anything about the plate. "Then you've eaten," she said, "and you can come for conversation and whatever's still hot. My children have been underserved for company. Their own age isn't the only shortage we've got." She wasn't sure where that came from. It wasn't the speech she'd been composing during the walk over. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but something. "Pot roast," he said, "and biscuits. Anna made the biscuits, so they're lopsided, but they taste fine." A long pause. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere behind the cabin, a horse shifted and blew. "I'd need to wash up," Caleb said finally. "Take your time," Eleanor said. "We'll be waiting." He came. He appeared at her door 20 minutes later with his face washed and his hair combed and wearing a shirt that was clean, if not pressed. And Eleanor opened the door and said, "Good, come in," with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd use for anyone. And she led him to the table and pulled out the chair opposite Pete Alderman without ceremony. He sat. James and Anna both stared at him for approximately 3 seconds, which was long enough for Eleanor to give James a look that meant "stop that," which James received and acted upon. Anna, being Anna, simply redirected her stare to the biscuit basket and began an unsolicited commentary on why certain biscuits were structurally superior to others, which immediately removed any awkward silence from the room. "She's always like this," James told Caleb by way of explanation. "I'm like this because I'm right," Anna said. Caleb looked at Anna and something in his face moved. Not a smile, not exactly, but the suggestion of a smile, like a door opening just an inch. "I had a dog like that once," he said. "Always certain." It was such an unexpected thing to say that even Anna stopped for a moment. "What kind of dog?" she asked. "Big red mutt. Part hound, maybe. I never was sure. Name was Henry. That's a person's name." He was about as smart as a person. Anna considered this with great seriousness. "Was he more smart than some people?" Caleb's expression moved again, and this time it made it all the way to something resembling a smile. Incomplete, rusty, like a hinge that hadn't been turned in years, but real. "Yeah," he said. "I think he was." He stayed for 2 hours. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was mostly in response to the children, who addressed him without the careful awkwardness that adults employed. James, once he'd assessed Caleb and reached some internal determination, began asking direct questions about cattle bloodlines and fence post depth, and whether the old Mercer property had ever run sheep, which it had not. Anna, once the topic of Henry the dog had been established, circled back to it approximately every 15 minutes from different angles, slowly constructing a complete portrait of a dog who had been dead for 15 years. Pete Alderman was quiet in his usual way, eating steadily and occasionally offering a word or two. Eleanor managed the food and the conversation and tried not to make Caleb feel observed, which was difficult because she was, in fact, observing him. What she saw was a man who had not completely gone away. He was in there. She could see it in the moments when Anna made him laugh, or almost laugh, that rusty, incomplete version, and in the way he listened to James's questions with genuine attention rather than the polite half-attention adults usually gave to children. He had presence. He'd just stopped directing it at anything. When he finally stood to leave, he picked up his hat from the hook by the door. She hadn't noticed him hang it there, but he'd found the hook and turned to her with an expression she found genuinely difficult to read. "That was a fine meal," he said. "Same time next week," Eleanor said, without making it a question. He looked at her. "You don't have to keep doing that," he said. "I know I don't have to." A beat. "You're a stubborn woman," he said. "My husband said that was my best quality," she told him. Something passed across his face at the word husband. Not discomfort, more like recognition, like a man who hears a word in a language he thought he'd forgotten. "Same time," he said, and put his hat on, and walked out into the dark. He came back the next Sunday. He didn't need to be asked. He simply appeared at the door at the same time as the week before, hat in hand, wearing the clean shirt again. Eleanor let him in and set his plate, and the meal proceeded much as the first one had, except that he talked a little more readily and the pauses between things were shorter. The Sunday after that, he came again, and the one after that. By the fourth week, Anna had stopped treating his arrival as an event and simply incorporated him into the existing landscape of Sunday dinners, which Eleanor recognized as the highest possible form of acceptance from an 8-year-old. By the fifth week, James had started asking him questions that required longer answers, about the Eastern Field, about water, about what his father had done with that land in the early years, and Caleb answered them with a specificity that revealed how much knowledge was locked up inside him, knowledge that had been sitting in the dark with him on those steps with nowhere to go. His posture changed slowly over those weeks, barely noticeable week to week, but clear enough if you compared the man who'd first sat at her table with the man who came in through the door on week 6. He still moved carefully, like someone acquainted with the cost of carelessness, but he held himself straighter. He started holding his own plate when she was dishing out food instead of waiting for it to come to him. It was a small thing. It meant something. The trouble when it announced itself arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a piece of paper. Caleb showed up one Sunday in early November, and he was different. Not in any way Eleanor could immediately name. He came in at the same time, sat in the same chair, responded to Anna's greeting with the same almost smile. But there was something held in him, some constraint, like a man carrying a weight he hasn't decided how to put down. It wasn't until the children had left the table and Pete had gone out to check on the animals, and it was just the two of them left with the remains of the meal between them, that he put a folded piece of paper on the table. Eleanor looked at it. "What is this?" "From the county assessor's office," he said. "Delivered Thursday." She unfolded it and read it. Her face didn't move much while she was reading. It was the kind of thing you learned to do when you managed a ranch alone, to read bad news with your face still, to process it privately before you let it show. When she finished, she put the paper down flat. "Victor Sloan," she said. Caleb looked out the window. Victor Sloan owned the Breckenridge operation that sat north of the Mercer property, the largest ranch in the county, possibly in 2 counties, assembled over years through a combination of good management, strategic marriage, and a willingness to apply pressure to smaller landholders in ways that were always technically legal and always perfectly understood. He was not a man you accused of anything directly, because he never did anything directly. He had people who talked to county officials on his behalf. He had a lawyer in Kearney who knew how to phrase things. What the letter said, translated out of its formal language, was this: a formal inquiry had been submitted regarding the usage status of the Mercer property's eastern field and its associated water rights, on the grounds that the land had been largely uncultivated for multiple consecutive seasons. The county was initiating a review. An inspection would be scheduled. Water rights, once assessed as abandoned or underutilized, could be reassigned. "He's been wanting that water access for years," Caleb said. "Claire and I always figured it was only the threat of a fight that kept him off it. And now he thinks you can't fight." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He might be right. The words landed flat and honest, and Eleanor didn't argue with them. She'd seen the eastern field when she'd walked across the Mercer property in October. It was bad. 3 seasons of no attention. The irrigation channels were silted and partially collapsed. The field itself was scrub and weeds. It looked, to anyone who needed it to look a certain way, exactly like abandoned land. "What does your son say?" Eleanor asked. "Have you written to him?" Something changed in Caleb's expression. It hardened, subtly, the way ground freezes. "Lucas and I don't correspond," he said. She wanted to ask more, but something in his face told her this wasn't the moment. There was a line there, and she didn't yet know where it ran. "You need a lawyer," she said instead. "Lawyers cost money I'd need to pull from the cattle budget." "I know someone in Kearney who might consult without a full retainer." Caleb looked at her. "You don't have to get involved in this." "I'm your neighbor," Eleanor said. "This affects the water table on my south field too, if Sloan gets access to redirect that channel. So I'm already involved whether I choose it or not." That was true. It was also not the primary reason she was sitting here with her hands flat on the table and a letter about water rights between them. But it was a true thing to say, and it gave him a practical reason to accept help from someone he was clearly finding it difficult to accept help from. Caleb looked at the letter for a long moment. "I'll think on the lawyer," he said. "Think fast," Eleanor said. "That review process doesn't wait." Set. She thought about what he'd said. "Lucas and I don't correspond," for days afterward. She hadn't pushed. She'd restrained herself, which had cost her something, because she was by nature someone who pushed toward the thing that needed addressing, who found circling around a problem more exhausting than simply naming it. But she'd held back with Caleb, and she thought she'd been right to, because he was a man who'd been left to his own devices for so long that any pressure applied too directly would cause him to close like a hand in winter. She knew what she knew from James, who had gathered it through the particular social intelligence of 11-year-olds, which is often more accurate than the intelligence of adults. Lucas Mercer was maybe 32, 33. He'd left Nebraska some years back, after his mother's funeral specifically, or shortly after, under circumstances that involved shouting and a door and things said that didn't get unsaid. He'd gone east. Chicago, possibly, or somewhere larger. He worked in some kind of business capacity that no one in Grover's Crossing was entirely clear on. He had not returned. He had not returned for his father's illness the previous winter, when Caleb had spent 2 weeks in a state that the doctor described as serious. The Hollis family had checked in on him during that time. Eleanor had not known Caleb then. Their Sunday dinners were months in the future, but she'd heard about it after. He had recovered, and nobody talked about the son. Eleanor thought about this in the way she thought about other things that troubled her, at the edges of sleep, while doing the mindless physical work of ranch maintenance, in the brief silences between the children's needs. She rolled it over and looked at it from different angles without yet touching it, because she knew, without needing to examine it closely, that the legal problem and the son problem were the same problem. That what Caleb faced wasn't just an unscrupulous neighbor with county officials in his pocket. It was a man who had let his land go fallow for the same reason he'd sat alone on those steps for 3 years. Because grief had told him, quietly and persistently, that there was no point in defending what you'd built together if the person you built it with was gone. You could win a legal fight for him. You could maybe even clear the irrigation channels yourself with enough labor and time. But if you didn't give him something to fight for, something that made the effort feel like more than just delay, the ranch would find another way to slip away. Eleanor understood this because she recognized it. Thomas had been gone 2 years, and she still kept his chair at the table. December came, and with it the kind of cold that made the Nebraska plains feel like the edge of the world. Caleb still came for Sunday dinners. He never missed. But Eleanor could see the weight on him accumulating. The county review process was moving forward. The deadline for the Eastern Field Assessment was being set for early spring planting season. And though he'd gone to see the Kearney lawyer and received some cautiously useful advice about what documentation might help his case, the fundamental problem remained. Land that looked abandoned was treated as abandoned, regardless of the reason it had been left. He needed to work the field. He was 67 years old, had been functionally alone for 3 years, had spent a portion of the previous winter ill enough to frighten his neighbors, and the field was in worse shape than either of them had initially admitted. In January, on a Sunday when the cold had kept the children inside, and Pete had gone to visit his sister in town, and it was just the two of them at the table over the remains of a simpler meal than usual, Caleb said something that he'd been working up to for a while. She could tell by the way he cleared his throat twice first. "I want to thank you," he said. "You've thanked me before." "Not properly." He looked at his hands. "When Clara passed, I think I made a decision somewhere in there that I just hadn't admitted to myself, about being done with things." Eleanor waited. "I don't mean, not in the way some men get." He glanced up, wanting to make sure she understood. "Not like that. Just done with trying. Done with the ranch being something to protect. I'd been running it for 30 years, and I couldn't see the point of the next 30 without her in it." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "You talked me back into caring," he said, "and I'm not sure whether to thank you for that or hold it against you." She looked at him. "How's that?" "Because if I didn't care," he said, "Sloan taking the water rights would just be a thing that happened. Now it's a thing I have to fight. And I'm not sure I've got the fight left in me." The words were honest enough to hurt. Eleanor sat with them for a moment before she answered. "You do," she said, "but you might not be able to do it alone." He was quiet. "Lucas," she said. The words sat between them. "No," Caleb said. "Caleb, I said no. Not harsh, but final. Like a door that's been measured and fitted for a specific frame. That's a closed thing." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She didn't push. She'd learned where his lines were. But she thought about Lucas Mercer all the way through that cold January night and into February, and she thought about the eastern field going fallow in the spring while Victor Sloan waited with paperwork, and she thought about a man sitting alone on a porch for 3 years eating from a tin plate with nowhere to put all the things inside him. And she made a decision. It was not a comfortable decision. She knew what it might cost, but she'd learned, over 2 years of running a ranch alone, that the comfortable decisions were often the ones you regretted. She wrote the letter in early March, on a Wednesday evening after the children were in bed. She addressed it to Lucas Mercer, care of a business contact in Chicago whose name she'd gotten, through some effort, from a man in Kearney who'd known Clara Mercer's family. She didn't tell Caleb. She wrote, "Mr. Mercer, my name is Eleanor Hayes. I am your father's neighbor in Grover's Crossing. I am not writing to ask you to choose a side in something I don't understand. I am writing because your father is about to lose the land your family built, and because I believe, though I have no right to presume, that he would not say so himself, but he is also losing the other battle that matters more. He doesn't know I'm writing this. He would be angry if he knew. But I'm writing anyway, because someone has to, and because the time for waiting has passed." She sealed it before she could talk herself out of it. She mailed it the next morning, and then she went home and made breakfast and said nothing about it to anyone, and she lived with the weight of what she'd done in the particular silence of someone who has thrown a stone across dark water and now has nothing to do but wait to hear whether it lands. Though the weeks between March and April had a quality of held breath to them. Caleb came for Sunday dinners, and she looked at his face each time to see if he'd somehow found out, and each time he hadn't. He looked worse as spring approached. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm a stranger, but Eleanor had learned to read him. He wasn't sleeping well. The legal proceedings were advancing. The county had set the inspection date for the second week of April, which gave him roughly 3 weeks to demonstrate productive use of the eastern field or face the formal initiation of water rights reassignment proceedings. He had hired a day laborer from town to help clear some of the irrigation channels, a young man named Dale who was willing and not particularly experienced, and between the two of them they'd made some progress. But the field was large and the damage from 3 years of neglect was significant, and every time Eleanor walked across to check in, she could see the arithmetic in Caleb's face. The numbers didn't add up. "I need more hands," he said one Saturday, the two of them standing at the edge of the eastern field looking at the half-cleared channels. "And I need them to know what they're doing." "I can send Pete over for the week," Eleanor said. "He's worked irrigation. Your operation needs Pete." "My operation will manage." This was partially true. "He can come Monday." Caleb put his hat back on and looked at the field. His jaw was tight. Something about watching him look at it, at this land that had been his father's and then his, at the evidence of what 3 years of grief could do to a place, made Eleanor's chest ache in a way she couldn't resolve into any single simple feeling. "If we don't make it," he said, not looking at her. "If Sloan gets that water, we'll make it," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You're doing that thing where you say something certain when you don't actually know." "I know," she said. "I do that." He almost smiled. "At least you admit it." "Come to dinner tomorrow," she said. "Anna's been planning the menu all week, and if you don't come, she's going to be genuinely insufferable. Like she isn't already. She gets it from her mother, apparently." He did smile then. A fuller version than his early ones, more like a real thing. "Tomorrow," he said. The letter came back. Not the letter she'd sent. She hadn't expected that. What came back was a response, a single page, handwritten, with a Chicago return address. Eleanor read it standing at the mailbox in the cold April morning with the wind pulling at the page. It said, "Mrs. Hayes, I received your letter. I don't know what to do with it yet. I won't pretend things are simple, but I'm reading it. I will read it again. L. Mercer." She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She read it twice more on the walk back to the house. She didn't know if it was enough. She didn't know if Lucas Mercer was the kind of man who could bridge the distance between reading a letter and doing something about it, or whether the years and the silence and whatever had been said at that graveside had made the distance unbridgeable. But he'd responded. That was something. She went inside and started the breakfast fire and listened to Anna argue with the cat and James eat in his carefully indifferent way, and she kept the letter in her pocket for the rest of the day like a warm stone. The inspection was 10 days away. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. She hadn't told Caleb about the letter. She hadn't told him about the response. She was going to have to tell him. She just hadn't figured out when. It was a Thursday evening when she walked across to the Mercer property, not Sunday, which was unusual enough that Caleb noticed immediately. He was at the irrigation trench with Dale when she came across the field, and he handed his shovel to the young man and walked to meet her, reading something in her approach. "What's happened?" he said. She handed him the letters, both of them, the one she'd sent and the response. She put them in his hand and took a step back and let him read. He read slowly. When he finished, he held the pages at his side and looked at the field. "You wrote to my son," he said. "Yes." "Without asking me?" "Yes." A long silence. The wind moved through what was left of last year's dead grass at the edges of the field. "He might not come," Caleb said. "He might not," Eleanor agreed. "And if he does come, it doesn't fix anything between us. One letter doesn't—" He stopped, swallowed. "There are things that were said." "I know. You don't know." His voice had an edge in it, but it was the edge of something painful, not something angry. "No," she said, quieter. "I don't. You're right." He looked at the response in his hand. "I will read it again." "Why?" he asked. Not how dare you, not an accusation, a genuine question, and something underneath it that was almost afraid of the answer. "Because nobody was going to," Eleanor said. "Because he needed to know and you weren't going to tell him, and the inspection is in 10 days and—" She stopped and started again, more simply. "Because I was sitting in my house one night in March thinking about you eating alone on those steps for 3 years, and I thought, someone has to do the thing that's hard." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "He might not come," he said again. "I know." He folded the letters carefully, the way people handle things they're not ready to throw away. He put them in his shirt pocket against his chest. "I've got 3 more hours of daylight," he said. "I should get back to the trench." "Okay," Eleanor said. He turned, then stopped. "Eleanor?" he said, without turning around. "Yeah. Thank you." A pause. "And I'm angry about it." "I know that too," she said. He went back to the trench. She walked home as the light began to go long and gold across the Nebraska plains. And she thought about all the things that were now in motion that she could no longer control, and she set her jaw and kept walking. The night before the inspection, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind and running through every version of the next day she could imagine. The inspectors arriving, the field in its current state of partial recovery, Caleb standing on that land with Dale and Pete, and whatever they'd managed to accomplish in 3 weeks of hard work. She tried to assess it honestly, without the comfort of false optimism. It wasn't enough. What they'd done was real, and it was visible, and it showed use and intention, but the eastern field was still visibly struggling, and Victor Sloan would have people there who knew how to articulate exactly what they were looking at. She turned over, turned back. She thought about Lucas Mercer in Chicago, reading a letter. She thought about Caleb with those folded pages against his chest. She thought about Thomas's chair at her dinner table and about how long it takes for absence to stop feeling like presence, and whether it ever actually does or whether you just build around it until you can't see it as easily from certain angles. At some point, she slept. She was awake again before the sun, and she dressed and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, and the morning was very still. She would go over there early. She would stand with him through whatever the day brought. That was what you did. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was the only answer she'd ever found to the question of how you lived on this particular land in this particular life. You showed up. You showed up when it was cold and when it was inconvenient and when you weren't sure it was going to matter. You showed up because the alternative was Caleb Mercer on those steps with a tin plate, eating alone while the world looked past him and called it peace. She poured the coffee out and went to get her coat. Whatever today was, she would face it standing next to him. She put her hand on the door. Outside, in the direction of the Grover's Crossing Road, she could hear the distant sound of a horse and wagon, coming from town. She stood very still and listened, and she wondered, in the held breath of that cold April morning, whether what was coming toward them was just the county inspectors arriving early, or something else entirely. The wagon came from the direction of the Grover's Crossing Road, and Eleanor stood at her door with her hand on the frame and listened to it get closer. In the early morning, sound carried differently, flatter, cleaner, with nothing yet stirring to absorb it, and she could tell from the weight of the wheel noise that this wasn't a light rig. 2 horses, maybe, or a heavy single, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than wandering. She went out onto the porch. The sun was barely above the horizon, throwing long shadows across the frost-hardened ground, and the air had that particular sharpness that April mornings in Nebraska kept in reserve, the kind that reminded you winter wasn't entirely finished with you yet, regardless of what the calendar claimed. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the road. It was not the county inspectors. The wagon that came into view around the bend was driven by a man she didn't recognize immediately. Youngish, maybe early 30s, wearing a city coat that was wrong for this weather, in the specific way that city things were always wrong for Nebraska weather, cut for appearance rather than function. He was sitting forward on the bench with his elbows on his knees, and he was looking at the land with the expression of someone trying to reconcile what they're seeing with what they remember. Eleanor understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, who this was. She went back inside, put on her boots, and walked across to the Mercer property before she gave herself time to think about whether this was the right move. It probably wasn't. She was about to be in the middle of something that she'd put herself in the middle of deliberately, and there was a reasonable argument that the decent thing would be to let it unfold without her present. But Caleb was going to need someone standing nearby who wasn't a county inspector or a son he hadn't spoken to in years, and she had made her choices about this situation already, and here she was. She got to the Mercer cabin just as the wagon was pulling up. Lucas Mercer climbed down from the bench with the careful movements of a man who'd been sitting for a long time and whose body was reminding him of it. He was taller than she'd pictured from James's description, broad through the shoulders, with his father's jaw, though not yet his father's lines. He looked around the property with that same assessing expression, and then he saw Eleanor standing near the fence, and he stopped. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Mercer." She held out her hand and he shook it, a brief firm grip. "You made good time. Left Chicago 4 days ago." He glanced at the cabin. "He doesn't know I'm coming." "No." "Does he know about your letter?" "He does now. I told him last week." Something moved through Lucas's expression. Not quite irritation, not quite relief. "How'd he take it?" "About how you'd expect," Eleanor said. "He was angry, and then he wasn't." Lucas looked at the cabin again. The door was closed. No sign of movement yet. It was early, and Caleb was likely still inside or had already gone to the eastern field. "I should tell you," Lucas said. "I don't know what I'm walking into here. I know about the water rights situation. Your letter was clear, but the other part—" He stopped, looked at his hands briefly, then back up. "My father and I said things after my mother died that don't come undone easy." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm not expecting it to be easy." "Then what are you expecting?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm expecting it to be hard and necessary, same as most things worth doing." He studied her for a moment. Then he made a short sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. "My mother would have liked you," he said. "I hope so," Eleanor said. "Go knock on his door, Mr. Mercer. I'll be in the field if either of you need something." She walked away and left him standing there, because some things needed room that she couldn't provide just by stepping back. She didn't hear the door open, but she heard it, some minutes later, close. She gave them an hour. She spent it in the eastern field with Pete, who had arrived at first light and was already deep in the work of the irrigation channels without being asked, which was one of the things she valued most about him. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Pete doing the heavier clearing and Eleanor assessing the channel levels and the flow, taking notes in the small book she kept in her coat pocket. The field looked better than it had in February. That was true. But better than February wasn't the same as good, and she kept running the inspection deadline against the state of the channels and arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion she'd been arriving at for 2 weeks. "We need another day at minimum," Pete said, not looking up from the channel wall he was reinforcing. "We have today," Eleanor said. "Inspectors are due this afternoon." Pete made a sound of moderate profanity under his breath and kept working. At some point, she became aware that she wasn't alone in the field anymore. She looked up and found both of them, Caleb and Lucas, standing at the field's edge, not quite next to each other, maybe 3 feet of space between them that had the particular quality of distance that has been negotiated rather than natural. She walked over. Caleb's face was unreadable in the way faces get when someone has been through an emotional conversation and is now in the process of putting themselves back together. Lucas had his hands in his coat pockets and was looking at the field with an expression she could only describe as reckoning. "How bad is it?" Lucas said, to her, to Pete, to the general air. "The South Channel is passable," Eleanor said. "The East Lateral is the problem. We've cleared about 2/3 of it. The blockage at the far end is significant." "What kind of blockage?" "Silt and collapse. There was a section of the wall that came down, probably 2 winters ago, and filled a 15-foot stretch. We've been digging it out, but it takes time." Lucas nodded slowly, still looking at the field. "I know that section," he said, more to himself than anyone. "Dad and I dug that channel when I was 14. Hit hard pan about 8 feet in and had to go around." He turned to Caleb. "You remember that? We were out here for 3 days. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I remember your mother brought lunch out both days because you kept forgetting to come in." It was a simple thing to say, and it landed in the air between them with a weight that Eleanor felt from 3 feet away. Lucas looked at his father, and his father was looking at the ground, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched until Pete coughed and broke it. "Could use another shovel," Pete said, to no one in particular. Lucas pulled his hands out of his pockets. "Where do you keep the tools?" The 4 of them worked through the morning. Lucas stripped off his city coat within the first half hour and hung it on a fence post, and worked in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, and Eleanor noticed that he was not unpracticed at this. He moved with the efficient economy of someone who grew up doing physical labor before he went somewhere that didn't require it of him. He and Caleb worked near each other without working together exactly, which Eleanor thought was probably the right pace. You didn't rebuild 32 years of something in a morning, but you could work the same ground, and sometimes that was where it started. She watched Caleb when she thought he wasn't looking. He was moving better than she expected given the weeks of strain. There was something in him today that she hadn't seen in a while, a quality of directed energy that was different from the effortful going through motions she'd seen in March. She didn't want to name it too precisely, afraid of being wrong. But it was there. Around mid-morning, Dale arrived from town and his eyes went wide when he saw Lucas. Eleanor introduced them briefly and put Dale to work on the South Channel, and the field filled with the sounds of 5 people working against a deadline, which was its own particular kind of music. They stopped at noon when Eleanor walked back to her property and returned with a basket, bread, cold beef, coffee, in the heavy ceramic jug she used for field work. She spread it out on the tailgate of Caleb's wagon, and they ate standing up, nobody suggesting they break for long enough to sit, because the inspectors were due in 4 hours, and the East Lateral was not finished. It was the first time Eleanor had seen Caleb and Lucas near each other for any sustained period, and she tried not to watch them in a way that was obvious. They didn't talk much during the meal, but at one point Lucas handed Caleb the coffee jug without being asked, the way you do with someone whose habits you know, and Caleb took it the same way. And Eleanor thought, there it is. That's what's still there. The thing that had been built over 30 years didn't disappear because of 3 years of silence. It was just buried under it. The way the irrigation channel was buried under silt. Still there, still shaped the same, just requiring the work of clearing. After they ate, Lucas walked the length of the East Lateral by himself, studying it. Eleanor watched him from a distance, not interrupting. He stopped at the blockage section and stood there for a while, hands on his hips, head down. Then he walked back to where Pete and Caleb were, and he said something Eleanor couldn't hear. Caleb's posture shifted slightly. Then he nodded. Pete went to get more tools. Whatever Lucas had said, it changed the approach to the blockage, because in the next 2 hours they moved more of it than they'd moved in the previous week. Eleanor contributed what she could and stayed out of the way when she was in the way, and watched the slow geometry of the channel clearing and tried to calculate against the clock. The inspectors arrived at 3 in the afternoon. There were 2 of them, a county land assessor named Garfield, whom Eleanor recognized vaguely from a property dispute she'd had settled 2 years prior, and a man she didn't know who carried a leather satchel and wrote things down continuously, which she recognized as the county recorder's representative. They came in a clean wagon that sat sharply against the rough pragmatism of the working equipment around the field. Victor Sloan did not come himself. He never came himself. But the man who stepped out of the wagon behind the assessor and recorder, a thin, precise-looking man in a good coat, had the look of a lawyer, and Eleanor felt her jaw tighten. Sloan's lawyer. Caleb met them at the field's edge. Eleanor stayed nearby. Lucas stood a few feet to Caleb's left, and she saw Garfield's eyes move to Lucas and register something. Surprise, possibly, or recognition. "Mr. Mercer," Garfield said, extending a hand. "Professional, not unfriendly. We spoke at the county office." "We did," Caleb said. "I wasn't aware you're... Is this your son?" Garfield asked, looking at Lucas. "Lucas Mercer," Lucas said. He shook the assessor's hand without the hesitation Eleanor half expected. His voice was even and clear, and she realized he was probably good at this, had probably spent years in Chicago being even and clear in rooms where it mattered. "I've come to help manage the spring operations." The lawyer, Sloan's man, was already looking past them at the field, and Eleanor watched his face do the professional equivalent of nothing, which meant he was looking for what he'd expected to find and calibrating whether he'd found it. "We'll need to walk the perimeter," Garfield said, "inspect the channel condition and the planted acreage, assess signs of active cultivation." "Of course," Caleb said. "I'll walk with you." They moved out into the field. Eleanor stayed at the edge with Pete and Dale, who'd been dismissed from the active work now that the formal inspection was underway. The 3 of them watched the small procession move across the field, Caleb and Lucas flanking the inspectors, Sloan's lawyer trailing and writing things in a notebook of his own. "How's it look?" Pete said quietly, not turning his head. "Better than February," Eleanor said. "I don't know if it's enough." Pete grunted. Dale said nothing because he was 22 and understood correctly that this conversation didn't require him. They watched Garfield stop at the south channel and crouch down to examine the flow. They watched the recorder write something. They watched Sloan's lawyer stand with his hands behind his back at a distance that was perfectly calculated to look neutral, while being entirely not neutral. Then they moved toward the east lateral. Eleanor held her breath in the specific way of someone who's done all they can do and now has to stand still and wait for the result. At the east lateral, Garfield stopped and crouched again. He ran his hand along the newly cleared channel wall. He looked at the flow, still modest but moving, which was the critical thing. Water was moving through a channel that 3 weeks ago had been a collapsed, silted-over ditch. He looked at the ground at the channel's edge, at the evidence of recent digging, at the broken-up hardpan and the overturned clay. He said something to the recorder. The recorder wrote. Then Garfield stood and turned to Caleb. "When was this section last opened?" he asked. Caleb was quiet for half a second. Then, "This week. We identified the collapse in February and have been working it since." "And the planting status on the eastern acreage?" "We're late in the season," Lucas said, stepping in with the smooth precision Eleanor had predicted. "The field rehabilitation has taken priority. We have seed ready and will begin breaking the south quadrant this week." Sloan's lawyer looked up from his notebook. "The formal assessment criteria," he said, directing this at Garfield with careful courtesy, "include current productive use. A channel cleared this week and acreage not yet broken doesn't constitute active cultivation under County Statute 24. "I know what it constitutes," Garfield said mildly, and the lawyer stopped. Garfield looked at the field again, at the channels, at the worked earth. Then he looked at Caleb, and Eleanor, watching from 50 yards away, couldn't read what passed between them in that look. Garfield had a professional face, and Caleb had learned to keep his feelings inside, And it was the kind of moment that resolved itself in silence and then became clear only afterward. "We'll file our full assessment within 10 days, Garfield said. "I'll note the channel rehabilitation and the intent to plant. I'll need documentation of the seed procurement." "I have receipts," Caleb said. The lawyer opened his mouth. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Harwick," Garfield said to Sloane's lawyer, which meant the conversation with him was concluded, and turned back to Caleb. "We'll be in touch." They walked back to their wagon. Sloane's lawyer walked with them, and Eleanor could see from the set of his shoulders that he was dissatisfied, and found she had very little sympathy to direct at that dissatisfaction. The wagon left. The field went quiet. Eleanor walked out across the turned earth toward Caleb and Lucas, and she could see them both watching the wagon go, neither of them moving, the space between them still there but slightly smaller than it had been at dawn. "He didn't rule against you," she said when she reached them. "He didn't rule for me either," Caleb said. "He noted the rehabilitation," Lucas said. "That matters. If Sloane's people push for a formal hearing, it's a different case than if he'd walked out here and found 3 years of untouched weeds." Caleb was quiet. He was looking at the eastern field, at the channels they'd cleared and the ground they'd turned and the work that had taken 4 people most of a day and was still not finished. "It might not be enough," he said. "No," Lucas agreed. "We need to plant before the hearing." A silence. "That's a week of work," Caleb said. "Maybe more." Lucas said, with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about what they're going to say and has decided to say it simply, "I can stay." Caleb turned and looked at his son. Lucas met his eyes. "If you'll have me," he said. It was not a clean moment. It was not the kind of reconciliation that smoothed everything over and left no marks. It was 2 men standing in a cold field over broken ground, one of them old and tired and the other carrying years of something unresolved, and neither of them knowing exactly how to hold this yet. But Caleb looked at his son for a long moment, and then he looked at the field, and then he said, "There's a cot in the back room." Lucas nodded once. Eleanor looked at the 2 of them and felt something ease inside her chest that had been tight for months, though she kept her face still because this wasn't hers to show. She turned and looked out at the eastern field, at the channels that were partially cleared and the ground that was partially broken and the season that was running out. And she started calculating what the next 7 days would need to look like. There was still a great deal to do, and the land didn't care about reconciliations or inspectors or letters from Chicago. It only cared whether you worked it. "Tomorrow, early," she said, to both of them, to neither of them. "Pete can be back by sunrise if I ask him tonight." "I'll be up," Lucas said. Caleb picked up a shovel that was leaning against the wagon wheel and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a familiar object you've been estranged from. "Still a few hours of light," he said. He walked back out into the field. After a moment, Lucas followed. Eleanor watched them go. The old man and his son, moving across the uneven ground toward the east lateral, the light going long and amber behind them. And she thought about letters sent across dark water and stones you couldn't take back after they'd left your hand. And she thought that sometimes you threw something into the dark, not knowing what you were going to get back. And sometimes what came back was not what you'd expected, but it was exactly what was needed. She picked up Pete's shovel from where he'd left it against the fence, and she went back to work. The 10 days that followed the inspection had a quality Eleanor would later struggle to describe accurately. Not quite hope, because hope felt too clean for what it actually was, and not quite dread, because dread implied passivity, and nobody on that land was passive. It was more like the feeling of a long-held breath that you couldn't yet release because you didn't know whether what was coming deserved a sigh of relief or something else entirely. Lucas stayed. He slept on the cot in the back room of the Mercer cabin and was up before Caleb most mornings, which Eleanor learned because she came across at first light twice that week, and both times found him already at the field with a lantern, working the east lateral before the sun was high enough to see by natural light. She didn't comment on this. She understood it for what it was. A man trying to make up for something with his hands because he didn't yet have the words for it, or maybe because words weren't the right instrument yet and labor was. Caleb watched his son work and said little about it, which was its own form of communication. By the 4th day, the east lateral was fully cleared. Water moved through it in a thin but steady current that caught the early light and made it look more significant than it was. And Eleanor stood at the channel's edge and let herself feel something approaching cautious satisfaction before reminding herself that cleared channels weren't planted fields, and planted fields weren't the county assessor's ruling, and none of it was finished yet. South quadrant first, Lucas said beside her, looking at the field map he'd drawn in his notebook. A careful, practiced hand, she noticed, someone used to dealing with plans and layouts. We can break it in 2 days if we run both teams, then seed immediately. If we get rain midweek, like Pete says. Pete's not always right about rain, Eleanor said. He's right more than he's wrong. I checked his calls against the season record Caleb keeps. He tapped the notebook. 73%. She looked at him sideways. You went through your father's records. He keeps good records. A pause. Better than I remembered. She let that sit without adding to it, because it was the kind of thing that didn't need her to do anything with it. They broke the South Quadrant in 2.5 days. Pete ran one team with Dale, Lucas and Caleb ran the other, and Eleanor moved between them, managing the pace and the water distribution and the endless logistical questions that arose when you were pushing land hard against a deadline. She also managed her own property during this period, which meant her days started before sunrise and ended after dark. And by Thursday of that week, she was running on coffee and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. James noticed. He was 11 and perceptive in ways he didn't fully articulate, and he found her at the kitchen table one evening when she'd thought he was asleep, her hands wrapped around a cold cup and her eyes focused on something that wasn't in the room. Are you okay, Mama? She looked up. I'm fine. Why are you awake? Heard you come in. He sat down across from her with the careful gravity of someone who has decided to be taken seriously. Are Mr. Mercer's things going to be okay? I think so. I hope so. What happens if they're not? She considered giving him the comfortable answer and decided against it. He was asking like an adult and deserved something close to an adult response. If the county rules against him, Victor Sloan gets access to redirect the water channel. It would hurt Mr. Mercer's operation significantly, maybe enough to force him to sell. James processed this. Would he have to leave? Probably. A silence. James looked at the table, at some thought he was working through. I don't want him to leave, he said, and it came out younger than everything else he'd said, which was the honest center of it. Eleanor reached across and put her hand briefly on his. Me neither. Now go to bed. He went. She sat for a while longer in the kitchen with the cold coffee and thought about how quietly people become necessary to each other, and how you don't notice it happening until they're woven in so completely that the thought of their absence feels like something structural failing. The letter from the county arrived on a Tuesday. Not the formal ruling, that was still being processed, according to Garfield's timeline. What arrived was a notice that a formal hearing had been requested by an interested party, language that meant Sloan's lawyer had pushed for a full proceeding rather than accepting the assessor's preliminary findings, and that the hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, 6 days away. Caleb read the letter at Eleanor's kitchen table, where he'd come for Sunday dinner the day before and stayed because they'd ended up talking through the planting schedule until late, and walking home in the dark had seemed pointless. He read it twice, folded it, and set it on the table. Lucas was standing at the window. He'd come for Sunday dinner too, which had been, Eleanor thought, the most complicated and also the most ordinary meal she'd hosted in years. Complicated because of the weight both men brought with them into any shared room. Ordinary because Anna treated Lucas with the same relentless curiosity she directed at everything new, and James had asked him detailed questions about Chicago that kept the conversation moving through the silences. Lucas had answered James's questions with the patience of someone who was grateful for the direction. Now he turned from the window and looked at his father. A hearing is actually better for us, he said. Caleb looked up. How is it better? Because a preliminary assessment can be appealed quietly and overturned without public record. A hearing is on record. Garfield has to justify his recommendation in front of witnesses. Sloan's lawyer has to make his case openly. He came to the table and sat. If we go in there with documentation, the seed receipts, the channel work, a planting schedule with signed witnesses, it's a harder argument for them to make. Sloan has county officials, Caleb started. Garfield isn't Sloan's man, Lucas said. I talked to him. Eleanor and Caleb both looked at him. When? Eleanor said. Thursday. I went to the county office while you were working the north fence. He said this evenly, without apology. I wanted to understand the room. Garfield is a fair man, methodical. He doesn't like being pressured, and Sloane's lawyer pressuring him for a hearing when Garfield's own preliminary notes were favorable. That's irritated him. It works in our favor if we give him something solid to stand behind. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You went to the county office without telling me. Yes. Another silence, the kind that had a specific texture to it. Not hostile exactly, but close. Is that something you do? Caleb said. In Chicago? Make decisions without consulting the people involved. Lucas met his father's eyes. Sometimes. When I think it's the right move. This isn't Chicago. No. A pause. But it's the same principle. You get information before you need it, not after. Caleb held his son's gaze for a moment, and Eleanor watched something move through the older man's face. Frustration, but also underneath it, something that was almost unwilling recognition. He looked down at the table. What do we need for the hearing? He said. Lucas pulled out his notebook. The 6 days before the hearing were the hardest of the stretch, because the physical work had a direction and the waiting didn't. They finished planning the South Quadrant by Wednesday. Seed in the ground, channels running, the evidence of active cultivation as visible as they could make it. After that, there was nothing to do to the field that wouldn't look like desperate last-minute theater, and the remaining work was paperwork and preparation and the particular grinding anxiety of a thing that was now out of your hands. Eleanor organized the documentation. She was good at this, at finding the thread of a formal process and following it precisely, at understanding what a county assessor needed to see versus what a lawyer needed to argue against. She had a cleaner head for it than either Caleb or Lucas, who were both more comfortable with direct action than with the procedural architecture of official proceedings, for different reasons. She gathered the seed purchase receipts, dated early March, which was important, establishing that the intent to plant had preceded Lucas's arrival and therefore couldn't be argued as a staged response to the inspection. She gathered Caleb's property records, which went back to his father's original title, because the water rights were tied to the original land grant, and that chain of ownership was unbroken and documented and worth putting in front of Garfield explicitly. She got a written statement from the merchant in town who'd sold Caleb the additional supplies for the channel work, dated. On Thursday evening, she sat at Caleb's kitchen table with all of it spread out and organized, Lucas across from her working through the legal language of the water rights statute with a thoroughness that surprised her slightly. You've read law, she said. No, I've done contracts in Chicago. It's adjacent. He turned a page. The key phrase is demonstrable productive intent. They can't argue abandonment if we can show the intent was there continuously, even if the execution lapsed. 3 years of lapsed execution is a long time. There's precedent for medical and personal hardship as a mitigating factor. Caleb was ill last winter. The doctor has records. The doctor in Grover's Crossing keeps reasonable records, Eleanor said. I can ask. I'll ask, Lucas said. Quieter. It should come from me. She looked at him. He was looking at the statute, not at her. She didn't say anything about that either. She was learning when to let things move at their own pace. Caleb was at the other end of the table, nominally reviewing the property records, but actually, Eleanor suspected, only partly present. He'd been like this the last 2 days, physically there, functionally engaged when addressed, but with a quality of interior distance that she recognized. He was somewhere in the past. It happened to people who were fighting for something that held a lot of history. The history rose up with the fighting. Caleb, she said. He looked up. Go to bed. We've got what we need for tonight. He looked at the table of documents. You should sleep. Lucas and I can finish this. He looked at Lucas for a moment, that slightly different kind of look he still sometimes gave his son, like he was adjusting for the difference between the boy he'd last known and the man sitting across the table. Then he pushed back from the table and stood. Don't stay up past 10, he said, which was a thing that came out automatically and that he clearly hadn't planned to say because he stopped after it with a brief expression of something. Surprise at himself, maybe. Lucas looked at his father. Something in his face shifted, careful and controlled. But there. We won't, he said. Caleb went down the hall. The cabin was quiet except for the wind outside and the sound of papers. After a moment, Eleanor said, He used to say that to you. Every night until I was 19, Lucas said. He was looking at the statute page. Drove me insane. She didn't ask the obvious question. He answered it anyway, after a pause. My mother died on a Tuesday in October, he said. By Thursday, we were all ready. There were things to handle. You know how it is. The property, the arrangements, and then people in the house, and everyone talking. And my father... He stopped, organized his next words carefully. He shut down completely. The kind of shutdown where someone is moving and speaking, but they're not actually there. And I was 29, and I didn't know how to handle it, and I'd just lost my mother, and I needed him to be present, and he couldn't be. So you got angry, Eleanor said. I said things I can't take back. He set the papers down. He said things too, but mine were worse. You were grieving. So was he. He looked at his hands. I knew that. I knew it even then. It didn't stop me. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Why did you stay away so long? Because every time I thought about coming back, I'd think about what I'd said, and I'd think about having to stand in front of him, and he picked the papers back up. Pride is a stupid, costly thing. Yes, Eleanor said simply. Your letter made it impossible to keep pretending I had more time to figure it out. I know, that was the intent. He looked at her then, directly, with an expression she couldn't entirely classify. You took a significant risk. He could have refused to see me. Could have made things worse. He could have, she agreed. I thought about that. And you wrote anyway. The alternative was watching him lose everything he had left, alone. That seemed like a worse risk. Lucas held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the papers. They worked in silence for another hour. Buzz? The night before the hearing, Caleb couldn't sleep. Eleanor knew this because she couldn't sleep either, and she'd gotten up at 2 a.m. to sit on her porch in the cold with a blanket around her shoulders, and she could see across the cottonwoods to the faint light in the Mercier cabin window that hadn't been there when she'd gone to bed. She sat on her porch, and he sat in his cabin, and they were both awake in the 2 o'clock dark. Two neighbors with a fence between them and a shared problem that would be decided in the morning, and she thought there was something almost companionable about that, even across the distance. She went inside at 3 and slept until 5 and got up and made breakfast and packed the documents into the leather case Thomas had used for ranch business, which she hadn't opened in 2 years. It smelled like him inside, leather and something else, paper, and the particular tobacco he'd preferred on winter evenings. She stood with the case open for a moment longer than she meant to, then put the papers in and closed it. She picked up her coat. The county courthouse in Grover's Crossing was not an impressive building. It was functional in the way most things on the Nebraska frontier were functional, built to do a job without excess consideration for appearance. The hearing room had 6 rows of benches, a raised section for the assessor's table, and windows that let in the flat morning light at an angle that put half the room in glare. Victor Sloan was there. Eleanor had known he would be, but knowing it and seeing him were different things. He sat in the front row of the public benches with 2 men she didn't know, and Harwick, his lawyer, who was already arranged at the petitioner's table with a stack of papers and the composed expression of a man who considers the proceeding a formality. Sloan himself was in his early 60s, thick through the chest, with the particular confidence of a man who has won enough of these situations to stop being nervous about them. He didn't look at Caleb when Caleb came in. He looked at his watch. Caleb sat at the respondent's table. Lucas sat beside him, which was not strictly procedurally required, but which Garfield permitted without comment, when Lucas seated himself there and nobody objected. Eleanor sat in the first row of benches directly behind them. She put her hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder before he turned to face forward. He didn't turn around. But she felt the small shift in him, the slight settling. Garfield opened the proceedings with the kind of measured bureaucratic language that was designed to drain urgency from situations and failed completely in that purpose here. Harwick presented Sloan's case first, efficient, precise, devastating in its simplicity, 3 years of demonstrably uncultivated land. County Statute 24. The water rights were attached to productive use. Productive use had lapsed. His client was prepared to put the land and the water to immediate and substantial productive use. He had affidavits from 3 county residents attesting to the field's neglect over the relevant period. He had a surveyor's report. It was a good case. Eleanor sat still and kept her face neutral and acknowledged to herself that it was a good case, because pretending otherwise helped no one. Then Lucas stood up. He was not a lawyer. He didn't pretend to be one. What he was, Eleanor thought, was someone who had spent years making arguments in rooms where people wanted to say no, and had learned to build a case out of whatever material was actually available rather than the material he wished he had. He presented the seed receipts first, dated March, prior to the inspection. He presented the channel rehabilitation documentation. He presented the doctor's records of Caleb's illness the previous winter. He'd gotten those from Dr. Fenn 2 days ago, Eleanor knew, and had gone alone, and whatever conversation had accompanied that errand he hadn't reported and she hadn't asked about. He presented a statement from Pete Alderman, signed, describing the active rehabilitation work since February. And then he said something Eleanor hadn't known he was going to say. "I want to address the period of lapse cultivation directly," he said, looking at Garfield, "because I think it's the honest thing to do rather than argue around it. My father lost my mother 3 years ago. I am not offering that as an excuse for the state of the field. I'm offering it as a fact, because this proceeding is about the truth of what this land is and what it means, and what's been done to it, and the truth includes what loss does to a person. The statute includes hardship provisions. My father's hardship is documented. The rehabilitation is documented. The intent was never abandoned, even when the execution failed." He paused. "The intent was never abandoned," he said again, quieter. He just needed someone to remind him why it mattered. The room was quiet. Harwick leaned over to say something to Sloane. Sloane's expression didn't change, but he shifted slightly in his seat, and Eleanor recognized the shift. She'd seen it across negotiating tables and property lines and difficult conversations. It was the shift of a man who has recalculated and found the numbers less comfortable than before. Garfield looked at his papers for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "is there anything you want to add?" Caleb sat with his hands on the table. He hadn't spoken during any of Lucas's presentation. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at Garfield, and he said, "That field belonged to my father before it was mine. I built those channels when I was 22 years old, with my wife and one hired hand, before we had anything worth protecting. I let it go to ruin." He stopped. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't happen. It did. But water's moving through that channel again, and there's seed in that ground, and my son came back from Chicago to help me put it there." Another pause. "I don't think Victor Sloane needs that water. I think he wants it. There's a difference." The silence held for a moment. Sloane's jaw was tight. Garfield made a note. "We'll recess for 1 hour," he said. "I'll deliver my preliminary ruling before noon." Eleanor sat back on the bench and looked at the ceiling of the Grover's Crossing courthouse and listened to the room begin to move around her and thought, "It's done now. Whatever he decides, it's done. We said everything there was to say." She looked at Lucas, who had sat back down beside his father. Caleb had put his hand on the table, and Lucas had put his hand near it, not quite touching, maybe an inch of space between them. And neither of them was looking at the other, both of them facing forward, waiting. An inch of space. Eleanor thought about 3 years, about letters sent across dark water, about what it cost to close the last distance when you'd already come so far. She looked at the ceiling. The hour would pass, and then they would know. The hour passed the way hours do when you're waiting for something that matters. Not slowly exactly, but with a strange granular quality, each minute distinct and heavy, the way sand feels when you're carrying it in cupped hands and trying not to lose any. Eleanor sat on the courthouse bench and didn't pretend to be calm. She wasn't calm. She held the leather case across her knees and watched the room empty and refill as people stepped out for air and came back in. And she watched Victor Sloane across the aisle speak quietly to Harwick with the contained, unhurried manner of a man who has been in enough of these rooms to know that visible anxiety is a form of weakness. Sloane didn't look anxious. He looked like a man waiting for a train he'd already bought a ticket for. That bothered her more than anything else. Caleb and Lucas had gone outside during the recess. She'd watched them go, not together exactly, but in the same direction, through the same door, which was its own kind of progress. She hadn't followed. She'd stayed on the bench with the leather case and the flat morning light coming through the courtroom windows, and she'd thought about everything they'd put in front of Garfield and tried to assess it honestly and kept arriving at the same place. It was enough to make the argument. Whether it was enough to win the argument was a different question, and she didn't know the answer. She heard the door at the back of the room open and close, and when she looked up, Caleb and Lucas were coming back in. They'd been outside for 40 minutes. Neither of them looked particularly different from when they'd left, but there was something, she couldn't name it precisely, some shift in the air between them. Like two people who've said something they needed to say and haven't yet decided how to carry it. They sat. Lucas looked at his notebook. Caleb looked at the front of the room. Eleanor put her hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder again, and he covered it with his own hand for a moment, rough and dry, an old working hand, and then let go. Garfield came back in at 11:52. He arranged his papers with the methodical precision of a man who has done this many times and understands that the arrangement itself communicates something about the seriousness of the proceeding. He settled his glasses. He looked at both tables. Then he read his ruling. Eleanor listened to the formal language and translated it in real time, the way you learn to do with legal and official documents when you've been managing a property alone long enough that nobody else is going to do it for you. She listened past the whereas and the pursuant to and the having reviewed, and she waited for the center of it. It came 3 paragraphs in. The county finds insufficient grounds to classify the Mercer Eastern Field water rights as abandoned under Statute 24, given documented evidence of active rehabilitation efforts commencing February of the current year, establish medical hardship mitigating the period of reduced cultivation, and demonstrable productive intent as evidenced by current planning activity and operational channel infrastructure. She let out a breath slowly, through her nose, so it didn't show. Garfield continued reading. There were conditions. The field would be subject to a follow-up assessment at the end of the growing season. The water rights would remain formally under review pending demonstrated yield. There were documentation requirements. It was not an unconditional victory. The ranch was not safe forever. But the immediate threat was neutralized, and the formal reassignment proceeding was denied, and Victor Sloan's scheme to absorb the Mercer water access had, for now, collapsed. Harwick was already writing. Sloane's face showed nothing except for just a moment a tightening around the eyes that he controlled quickly and smoothly. He was a man practiced at losing things without showing it, which was also the kind of man who came back and tried again differently. Eleanor filed this away and held it. But that was a future problem. Right now, Garfield was closing his papers, and the room was beginning to move, and beside her she felt Caleb sit very still for a moment, in the specific way of someone absorbing news they'd half stopped letting themselves expect. Lucas turned to his father. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him, and Caleb looked back, and something passed between them that Eleanor didn't try to read because it wasn't hers to read. Then Lucas nodded once, a small, contained motion, and looked forward again. Caleb put his hands flat on the table and stared at them. "All right," he said very quietly. To himself, mostly. "All right." The drive back to the Mercer property was quiet in the way that follows something large. Not empty quiet, but full quiet. The kind where everybody is processing and nobody needs to fill it with sound. Eleanor drove her own wagon. Caleb and Lucas rode in Caleb's rig, and she followed behind them on the road that ran along the south fence, the same road where James had pointed out a man eating alone on his steps almost 8 months ago and changed the trajectory of more lives than either of them had understood at the time. She watched them from behind. They were talking. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the shape of it. Lucas saying something, Caleb listening, then responding. Not the careful, effortful exchange of two people trying to manage each other, but something that moved more naturally, with pauses that were comfortable rather than loaded. She thought about what they might be saying and then decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were saying it. When they pulled up to the Mercer property, Pete was there. He'd stayed behind to work the field, because that was Pete's way of handling uncertainty, to keep moving through it. And he came out from the east field when he heard the wagons with his hat in his hand and his face asking the question before his mouth did. "It held," Lucas said, climbing down. Pete put his hat back on. "Good," he said, and went back to the field, which was also Pete's way of handling relief. Eleanor unhitched her horse and walked to the edge of the east field and looked at it. The planted section was visible, the turned earth darker than the surrounding ground, the rows not perfectly straight because they'd been broken in difficult conditions by people working fast, but real. Real and in the ground and watered by channels that were open and running. It was not beautiful. It was functional and hard-won and still fragile, and the follow-up assessment at season's end meant that the next several months would require attention and consistency that couldn't lapse the way the last 3 years had. But it was alive. She heard footsteps behind her, and Caleb came to stand beside her at the field's edge. Follow-up assessment in October, she said. You'll need to document everything: yield records, water usage, channel maintenance log. I know, he said. I can help you set up a recording system. Thomas used a weekly ledger format that... Eleanor, his voice was patient. I know. We'll do it. She stopped, recognized herself. Sorry, I do that. You do, he agreed, not unkindly. They stood there for a moment looking at the field. The afternoon had turned warmer than the morning. One of those April turnarounds that Nebraska occasionally produced as if to apologize for everything that had come before. What did Garfield say to you? Eleanor asked. After. I saw him speak to you privately. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said Sloane's lawyer had pressured him for 2 weeks before the hearing. Phone calls, letters. He said it was the most pressure he'd received on a single assessment in 12 years. And he said he didn't appreciate it. Something in Caleb's face moved. He also said, and this was off the record, he made that clear, that the documentation we brought was better than anything he'd seen from a respondent without legal representation. He asked if we had a lawyer. Lucas. He said the name with a quality she couldn't quite identify. Not pride exactly, though that was in it. More like the particular feeling of being surprised by someone you should have expected more from all along. He's good at it. Whatever it is he does in Chicago, he's good at it. Did you tell him that? A pause. Not yet. Caleb, I know. He looked at the field. We talked during the recess. Outside, it wasn't... He stopped, looking for the right way to put it. It wasn't a resolution. That's not how it works. You can't resolve years of things in an hour outside a courthouse. But we said, another stop. There were things said at Clara's graveside that I've been carrying for 3 years as if they were permanent. And standing out there today, I thought, they're only permanent if we let them be. Eleanor said nothing. Let it be what it was. He's going back to Chicago, Caleb said. He has to. He has a life there, obligations. I understand that. But he came, Eleanor said. He came. Caleb picked up a clod of freshly turned earth, turned it in his hand, set it back down. That means something. I told him it meant something. Eleanor nodded. He's going to come back in the summer, Caleb said. He said he'd come back. I don't know if he will. He will, Eleanor said, with more certainty than she strictly had evidence for. But she'd read Lucas's face when he looked at his father, and she believed it. Caleb didn't argue with her. Maybe he believed it too, and just needed someone else to say it first. Lucas left 3 days later. He came to Eleanor's door the evening before he departed, hat in hand, which she found unexpectedly formal given everything they'd been through together in the last 2 weeks. I want to thank you, he said. People keep saying that to me, and I never know what to do with it, she said. Come in. I have coffee. He came in, and James immediately began questioning him about Chicago's commercial district with the focused intensity of a boy who has decided where he wants to go someday. And Anna demanded to know if Chicago had dogs smarter than Henry. And Lucas sat at Eleanor's kitchen table for the last time and answered all of it with a patience that she thought his father probably didn't give him credit for. After the children were in bed, Lucas sat across from Eleanor with his coffee and said what he'd actually come to say. He's not going to ask for help easily, he said. You know that. He's going to push back when things get hard. He's going to try to manage it alone. He's going to... I know what he's going to do, Eleanor said. I've been watching him for 8 months. Lucas looked at his coffee. I know you have. I'm not... He stopped. I'm asking you to keep watching. That's all. Because I'm going to be 2 days away by train, and I'm going to write, and I'm going to come back. But in between, I'll be here, Eleanor said. I'm his neighbor. I was his neighbor before any of this. You're more than that now. She held his gaze for a moment. I'm his neighbor, she said again, not dismissing what he'd said, but setting it in its right proportion. And I'll be here. Lucas nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands a few times. My mother would have done what you did, he said. Written that letter. She was like that. She saw things other people looked past, and then she did something about them. He looked up. After she died, I think my father stopped believing anyone else would see him the way she did, like that capacity had left with her. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. I didn't see him the way she did, she said carefully. I just saw him. For him, Lucas said, after 3 years of being invisible, that was enough. The morning Lucas left, Eleanor didn't go over to the Mercer property. She gave them the morning. She had her own work to do, her own property, her own fields, the perpetual maintenance of a ranch that didn't pause for other people's significant moments. And she did it, and she didn't watch the road from the Mercer place to see when the wagon pulled out. She heard it, though. She was at the south fence when she heard the horse and wagon on the road, and she straightened up and looked, and Lucas was heading toward Grover's Crossing with his bag in the back and his city coat on again, and he raised one hand briefly as he passed the fence line without looking to see if she was watching. She raised her hand back, then she went back to the fence. The following Sunday she went across to invite Caleb for dinner and found him already working, not sitting on the steps. Working, he was at the near edge of the east field with a measuring line, laying out the sections for the growing season documentation the county had required, and he looked up when she came across and said, I'll come tonight if that's all right. I want to finish this section first. Come when you're ready, she said. Anna's making biscuits again. Lord help us, he said, which surprised a laugh out of her. She went back home and made dinner and set the extra plate without thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about things that have simply become part of how a table is set. He came. He came every Sunday after that, through April and into May, as the planted field began to show the first tentative evidence of what it might become. He was different now in ways that were hard to quantify. Not fixed. She didn't think he would ever be fixed. And she didn't think fixed was the right aspiration for a 67-year-old man who had lost the person he'd built his life with. But oriented, pointed toward something. He asked James about his plans in a way that showed he was listening to the answer, and he let Anna drag him into her increasingly elaborate theories about animal intelligence, and he talked to Eleanor about the ranch, both ranches, hers and his, with the practical investment of someone who has decided their future is worth managing. He talked about Lucas sometimes. He said Lucas had written, twice in May, with specific questions about the Eastern Field yield projections that Lucas wanted to track from Chicago, which Caleb relayed with something in his voice that he didn't name and didn't need to. He said Lucas had asked whether the doctor's follow-up on the winter illness had been kept, which it hadn't, and Caleb had gone to Dr. Fenn and kept it. He's going to be insufferable about the documentation, Caleb said one Sunday, in May, eating at Eleanor's table. Good, Eleanor said. I said that sarcastically. I know, she said. I didn't. He made a sound that was somewhere between exasperation and amusement, which had become one of his characteristic responses to her. And James looked up from his food to assess the exchange, and Anna said something about the cat, and the table moved on. The day the first visible green came through in the eastern field was a Thursday in late May, and Eleanor found out about it because Caleb appeared at her kitchen door at 7 in the morning while she was still making breakfast, which he had never done before. He was a man who respected the boundaries of unannounced morning visits, which made his presence at her door at 7, hat not even fully on, significant. She looked at his face. Come see, he said. She went. It was not a dramatic sight, by any objective measure. A field coming up was a field coming up, the thin first green of emerging grain, pale and tentative, and covering maybe a third of the planted section, uneven in the way that first growth always is, thicker where the soil had broken better, and thinner at the edges where the hardpan was closer to the surface. It was the beginning of a thing, not the thing itself. But Caleb stood at the edge of that field and looked at it with an expression that Eleanor had no adequate word for. She stood beside him and didn't say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. After a while he said, I need to write to Lucas. You do, she said. He's going to want to know the germination percentage by section. Probably. A pause. The morning was warming up, the kind of May morning that actually felt like a promise rather than a threat. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass at the far edge of the field. Eleanor, Caleb said. Yeah. He kept looking at the field. I know what you did. Not just the letter, all of it. The dinners, the legal business, Walking across that field every other day when you've got your own property to run. He stopped. I know what it cost. It didn't cost me much, she said. It cost you something, he said. And I want you to know I'm aware of it. She looked at the green coming up in the field his father had built, that he had nearly let go, that he had fought back to, that his son had come home for. You would have done the same, she said, if our situations were reversed. He thought about that, then, yeah, I think I would have. That's enough, Eleanor said. The meadowlark called again, further away now, moving off into the morning. Caleb squared his shoulders. She saw it happen, that particular straightening that was less about posture and more about intention, and looked at the field like a man looking at something he is responsible for and has decided to be equal to that responsibility. Long season ahead, he said. Always is, Eleanor said. And they stood there in the May morning, two people with work to do and land to tend, and a season laid out in front of them. And neither of them moved to leave just yet because the moment was worth standing in a little longer before the day pulled them back into it. The summer of 1884 was not kind to Nebraska, and it was not supposed to be. Heat came in June like it meant to stay, pressing down on the plains with a flat, unsparing weight that turned the horizon into a shimmer and cracked the hard pan along the fence lines into patterns that looked almost deliberate, like the land was trying to write something. The creek that fed Eleanor's south field dropped 2 feet by July. 3 of her neighbors' cattle died in a single week from a combination of heat and bad water upstream. The county road turned to powder and coated everything within 20 feet of it in pale alkaline dust that tasted like nothing so much as the idea of dryness. It was, in other words, a normal Nebraska summer. The Mercer Eastern field held. It did not hold easily or elegantly. The irrigation channels required constant attention through June and July. Silt worked back in at the joints. One section of the east lateral developed a leak that cost Caleb and Pete 2 days of work to locate and seal, and the heat stress on the emerging grain meant careful monitoring of the water schedule in a way that didn't leave much margin for error. Eleanor came across twice a week through the worst of June, sometimes more. She told herself it was because the water table situation affected her own south field, which was true. She also told herself she was checking on a neighbor, which was also true. She didn't examine too closely the third reason, which was that she had become someone who needed to know how that field was doing the way you need to know how something you've invested in is doing. Not ownership, not quite, but something adjacent to it that didn't have a clean word. Caleb kept records the way Lucas had insisted on. Weekly ledger entries, water usage, growth measurements at marked stations across the planted sections, weather notations. He was meticulous about it in a way that surprised Eleanor, until she remembered what Lucas had said about his father's records being better than he'd remembered. Caleb had always been meticulous. He'd just stopped applying it to anything for 3 years because meticulous record-keeping implies a future you're planning for, and he hadn't been planning for one. Lucas wrote twice in June. The letters were practical. Questions about the yield projections, suggestions about the water schedule based on regional agricultural reports he'd found in Chicago, a note about a channel lining technique he'd read that might address the silt problem. But embedded in the practical information were other things, smaller things that weren't about irrigation at all. He mentioned a restaurant he'd gone to with a colleague that served a dish his mother used to make. He mentioned that he'd found one of her letters in a box while looking for a contract document and had read it 3 times. He asked, in the last line of the second letter, how Henry the dog's legacy was holding up in the Hayes household, which told Eleanor that Caleb had been reporting Anna's conversations faithfully. She read this detail over Caleb's shoulder on a Sunday afternoon in late June when he showed her the letter, and she thought, there it is. That's what a family sounds like when it's trying to find its way back to itself. You should tell him about the section near the north drainage, she said. The yield there is ahead of projection. I put it in the Tuesday entry, Caleb said. Tell him directly. Don't make him infer it from the ledger. Tell him it's ahead. Tell him you're pleased about it. Caleb looked at her sideways. I'm not going to write my son a letter about being pleased. Why not? Because I don't write like that. You talk like that, she said. You just did 5 minutes ago, standing at that drainage section. You said, look at that. That's the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. You're very annoying, he said. Write it in the letter, Caleb. He wrote it in the letter. The October assessment arrived with the first cold front of autumn, the same kind of early season wind that had been blowing when Eleanor first really looked at the Mercer property back in September of the previous year. She stood at her kitchen window with a coffee cup and watched the cottonwoods move and thought about how much distance a year could cover when you were actually moving through it rather than sitting still. Garfield came out on a Tuesday. He came alone this time. No recorder, no Sloane's lawyer trailing behind him, just a county assessor with a clipboard doing a scheduled follow-up. Eleanor had expected to find this less tense than the April hearing and was wrong about that. She was wrong because the April hearing had been about the immediate crisis, and this assessment was about the longer question, whether what had been built back would hold. She stood with Caleb and Pete at the field's edge while Garfield walked the sections. The eastern field had come in at roughly 60% of what a fully productive season would have yielded. Not outstanding, not the number Caleb might have hoped for 10 years ago, but real and documented and clearly the output of actively cultivated land. The channels were maintained, the records were complete, the season had been worked. Garfield walked for 40 minutes. He made notes. He measured the channel flow at 3 points. He looked at the ledger Caleb brought out to him. All those weeks of weekly entries, in Caleb's careful hand, the numbers adding up to a record of intention made visible. When he came back to where they were standing, he didn't make them wait. "The field meets the productive use standard," he said. "I'll file the formal confirmation of water rights retention this week. You'll have the document by month's end." Caleb nodded. His face did the thing it did, the controlled thing, keeping it inside. But his jaw was tight in a way that Eleanor recognized as the physiological result of not letting relief show when you feel it enormously. "Thank you," Caleb said. Garfield shook his hand. Then, as he was turning to go, he paused and said something that Eleanor thought he'd probably been deciding whether to say since he arrived. "Mr. Sloane's operation put in another inquiry in August," he said, keeping his voice level and professional, "about a property on the county's west side. Different owner, similar situation." He picked up his clipboard. "I want you to know the review process works the same way for everyone." He left. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "He's going to keep doing it," Caleb said. Not surprised. Not even particularly bitter, just clear-eyed about it, the way you learn to be clear-eyed about the Sloanes of the world when you've lived long enough. They don't stop wanting what they want. They just find new angles. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'll be ready for it." She believed him. That was the difference between this October and the last one she could remember clearly on this property, standing at the edge of a field that had come in, with a man who had decided he was going to be here for the next problem and the one after that. "Come for dinner Sunday," she said. "Lucas is coming." Caleb turned to her. "He wrote about that. You knew before I did." "He wrote to me too," she said without apology. Something in Caleb's expression moved. Not hurt, more like the particular look of a man who is adjusting his understanding of a situation. "You two correspond." "We do." "Since when?" "Since he left in April. He wanted to know how the field was doing, and he didn't want to ask you directly because he didn't want you to think he was checking up on you." "He was checking up on me." "Yes." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Stubborn, the both of you." "Sunday," Eleanor said. 5 o'clock? Anna has been planning what to serve him for 2 weeks. He put his hat on. "God help us all," he said, which was what he said instead of thank you when the gratitude was too large to come out any other way. And she had learned to hear it for what it was. Lucas arrived on Saturday, a day earlier than expected, driving a rented wagon from the Grover's Crossing livery with a bag in the back and an expression on his face when he came down the road that Eleanor, watching from her porch by coincidence of timing, recognized as the specific expression of someone returning to a place they'd been afraid they might not come back to. He stopped when he saw her on the porch. "Field made it?" he called. "Field made it," she called back. He nodded once, the way he did when something resolved the way he'd hoped but wasn't going to make a performance of it, and drove on toward the Mercer property. She went inside and let them have the evening. What happened that Saturday night in the Mercer cabin she knew only in pieces, gathered over the following weeks from things Caleb said in his oblique way, and things Lucas said in his more direct way, and the general character of both men as she'd come to understand it. She knew they sat up late. She knew there was whiskey involved, which Caleb kept in a cabinet that had been closed for 3 years. and which Lucas reportedly found without being told where it was, because he'd known where it was when he was 12. She knew that at some point the conversation found the things that hadn't been said yet, the harder things, the ones from the graveside, the ones that had been sitting between them since that October 3 years ago when everything fell apart, and that those things got said, and that neither of them came out of it comfortable, because that's what honesty costs. But they were said. The silence they'd been living in had finally been smaller than the conversation it was holding back. She knew this because Caleb came for dinner Sunday with something different in his face. Not lighter exactly. Not the specific lightness of a man who has put down a burden, because some burdens don't go away, they just change form. More like someone who has stopped bracing for the weight and started learning to distribute it differently. It was a subtle thing. She almost missed it. She didn't miss it. Lucas came for Sunday dinner too. He sat across the table from his father, and James asked him about Chicago's rail infrastructure with the focused ambition of a boy who had made some private decision about his future. And Anna made Lucas judge a competition between two biscuits of apparently different structural integrity, and Pete ate steadily and said 4 words over the course of the whole meal, which was slightly above his average. At one point, Anna said, without any particular preamble, "Are you going to come back for Christmas?" The table went briefly quiet. Lucas looked at Anna with an expression that took a moment to settle. Then he looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at his plate. "I'm thinking about it," Lucas said. "You should," Anna said with absolute conviction, in the tone she used for things that were simply facts about the world. "It's better with more people." James looked pained at his sister's directness. Eleanor looked at her plate. Pete reached for the bread. Caleb said, still looking at his plate, "There's room." Lucas said, "All right then." And that was that, in the way that the most significant things are often that. Not a ceremony, not a formal declaration, just 2 words across a dinner table in the presence of people who would hold them accountable. He came for Christmas. He arrived 2 days before and stayed 4 days after. And the cabin that had been silent for 3 years had voices in it again. Not just the occasional careful exchange of 2 people still learning how to be in the same room, but actual noise. The noise of people who have remembered that they are related and have things to argue about, and opinions that conflict in history that is both a weight and a foundation. Eleanor heard it from her side of the cottonwood grove one evening, the night before Christmas, when she'd walked out to check on the south fence and the air was cold and still and carrying sound cleanly across the dark. She could hear them inside the cabin. A raised voice that was probably Lucas, a lower voice that was clearly Caleb, and then something that sounded like a disagreement about something entirely ordinary, the kind of disagreement that families have about nothing important and everything important simultaneously. She stood in the dark and listened for a moment and then went back inside because it wasn't hers to watch and because she'd already gotten what she'd walked out there for. Lucas came to her door on Christmas morning with a package wrapped in brown paper, which surprised her completely. "You didn't need to," she started. "I know I didn't need to," he said, which was so exactly what she would have said that she stopped. Inside the paper was a book, a collection of letters, published in Boston, from frontier women of the previous generation, women who'd managed land and households and difficulties of the kind that didn't get written about in the newspapers that arrived from the East. She held it in both hands and looked at it. "I found it in a shop in Chicago," Lucas said. "I thought of you." She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the specific way you mean things that are given to the part of you that doesn't get acknowledged much. He nodded and put his hat on and went back across the frost-hard ground to the cabin. And she stood in her doorway holding the book and watching him go and thought about the distance between a letter sent into the dark and a man crossing a Nebraska field on Christmas morning, and how that distance had been built. Not by grand gestures, not by any single dramatic act, but by the accumulation of small chosen things. Letters answered, dinners attended, shovels picked up, the gradual, unglamorous work of showing up. Ça? January brought more cold and the first letter of the new year from Lucas, this one addressed to both Eleanor and Caleb, which was new. It was mostly practical. Questions about the winter channel maintenance, a suggestion about the spring planting rotation based on the previous season's yield data, but it ended with a line that Eleanor read twice. I've been thinking about what you said, Mrs. Hayes, about how people become necessary to each other before you notice it's happened. I think that's true. I think it's also a good argument for noticing sooner. She folded the letter and put it on the kitchen table and went to get the children up for the day. James came down first, still half asleep, and sat at the table and looked at the letter without reading it because it wasn't his to read. He looked at the table itself, at the extra plate Eleanor had already set, because Sunday was tomorrow, and Caleb would come, and it had stopped occurring to her not to set it. "Mama," James said. Are we his family? Mr. Mercer's, I mean." She poured coffee and thought about the question, which deserved a real answer rather than an easy one. "Not in the legal sense," she said. "He has Lucas for that. But in the real sense." She looked at her son, who was 11 years old and had apparently been thinking about this for a while. "In the real sense," she said, "I think we're his people, and he's ours. What that's called doesn't matter as much as what it actually is." James considered this with the seriousness he directed at things that mattered to him. Then he nodded, satisfied, the way you're satisfied by an answer that matches something you already knew but needed to hear confirmed. Anna came down then, immediately and loudly in the middle of a theory about something she'd dreamed, and the kitchen filled up with mourning the way kitchens do, and Eleanor moved through it, making breakfast and listening to her children and thinking, not for the first time and not for the last, about a man eating alone on wooden steps 2 years ago, and about what it meant that he wasn't eating alone anymore. The thing she'd learned, the thing the Nebraska frontier had taught her through Thomas's death, and 2 years of managing alone and 8 months of Sunday dinners and letters sent across dark water, was this: loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of people who see you. You can be surrounded and invisible. You can be 200 yards from a road with wagons passing on it every day and be as alone as if you were the last person on the plains. What broke it was not pity. Pity looks and looks away. What broke it was the specific act of looking and then staying, of saying, "I see you there, eating alone on those steps, and I am not going to pretend I don't," of setting an extra plate and meaning it not as charity but as the simple insistence that another person's presence at your table is worth something. She had not saved Caleb Mercer. She wanted to be clear about that, in the way she was clear about things when she examined them honestly. He had saved himself, had chosen, over many Sundays, to come back to the table, to remember what warmth felt like, to fight for his land, to let his son come home. She had provided a circumstance. What he did inside it was his. But she'd learned that circumstances mattered, that the difference between a man who recovers and a man who doesn't is sometimes nothing more than whether someone looked up from their own hard life long enough to see him sitting there. It cost her something, that looking, time, effort, the opening of herself to someone else's weight when her own weight was already considerable. It had not been without cost. She didn't want to sentimentalize it into something painless, because it hadn't been painless, and the dishonesty of making it seem easy would be a disservice to anyone who was standing right now at the edge of their own reluctance, looking at a neighbor's porch and wondering whether it was worth crossing. It was worth crossing. That was the whole of what she knew. Spring came again to Grover's Crossing the way it always did, grudgingly, with setbacks, 2 weeks of warmth followed by a cold snap that killed the early blossoms and sent everyone back inside cursing, and then finally the real thing, tentative and then certain, the ground softening and the first green coming up in the fields. On the first truly warm Sunday of April, a year, almost exactly, from the day Lucas had appeared in a rented wagon on the Mercer Road. Eleanor walked across the cottonwood grove with her coat open for the first time in months and found Caleb not on the steps, not working the field, but standing at the fence line at the edge of his property looking south toward hers. He heard her coming and turned. "Thinking," he said, by way of explanation for standing at a fence in the morning. "About what?" He looked at the fence line, at the Mercer land on one side and the Hayes land on the other, at the channel that ran between them carrying the shared water that both properties depended on. "About whether to expand the planting into the north section this year," he said. "Lucas thinks we should. I'm not sure the channel capacity handles the additional irrigation load." "It can handle it if we shore up the joint at the north lateral," Eleanor said. "Pete and I have been meaning to do that section since February." Caleb looked at her. "You've been meaning to fix a joint on my property since February." "It benefits both sides of the fence," she said, which was true, and also not the complete answer, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed further. North section it is, then, Caleb said. He looked at the land, his land, all of it visible from this fence line, the eastern field that had come back, the channels that ran again. The cabin behind him with a letter from Chicago on the table inside that had arrived Thursday and that he hadn't finished reading because he'd gone to bed before he reached the end and hadn't been in any hurry to finish it because having more of it to read meant having something to look forward to tomorrow. "Eleanor," he said. "Yeah, I've been thinking about Clara's kitchen garden, the space on the south side of the cabin. It's been sitting empty 3 years." She waited. "I think I might put it back this spring," he said. "Anna said she wanted to learn to grow things. I thought, if you'd allow it, she might come over on afternoons and help." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. It was such an ordinary thing to offer. A patch of ground, an afternoon, a child learning where food comes from. There was nothing in it that should have made her throat tighten, and yet it did, because she understood what it meant for a man to plant a kitchen garden in a space his wife had kept, to decide that the ground was not a memorial, but a place where things could still grow. She'd like that very much, Eleanor said. He nodded. Looked at the fence line again. "Come for dinner tonight," he said. It was the first time he'd invited her, rather than the other way around. "I've got a chicken I've been meaning to do something with." She almost said something about how she needed to check what she had at home, the kind of reflexive management of logistics she defaulted to. Then she stopped. "What time?" she said. 5, he said. "Tell the children." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, and she watched him go. A 68-year-old man with a bad hip on the left side and more history behind him than ahead, walking back toward a life he'd almost let go of and had chosen, slowly and imperfectly and with a great deal of help, to come back to. She stood at the fence line for a moment longer. The morning was warm. The South Channel was running steady, carrying water across both their land. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, a bird was working through the same 3 notes over and over, either practicing something or trying to remember it. She thought about Thomas's chair at her table, which she had finally moved last month. Not replaced, not gotten rid of, just moved to the side of the room, where it sat now as a chair rather than as an absence. She had moved it on a Tuesday evening without ceremony, and had stood looking at the table with its rearranged geometry for a while, and had felt the specific mixture of grief and something else that doesn't have a proper name. The feeling of a life that is still in motion, still changing shape, still capable of holding things that haven't arrived yet. She turned away from the fence and walked back toward her own house, toward her children and her mourning and the particular ongoing project of her life, which was never going to be simple and never going to be finished, and was hers to work the same as the land was hers to work, season by season, with whatever she had. The table would seat 6 tonight. In Grover's Crossing, Nebraska, in the spring of 1885, that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.